Welcome to my humble abode, darlings. Come in out of the rain and get comfortable. I have a story to tell you, and I hope you enjoy. If you do, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. The Urban Fae, Prince of Griffins, Part 2, by Michael Lockhart. Tom Tildrum peered at me, the glow in his eyes more intense than I'd ever observed. He blinked hard and let out his signature, meow. I took in deep, calming breaths and eventually pulled myself back from the brink of angry madness. Thank you, King Tom. I may have been able to handle them with the rage, but this group was well trained and prepared. It would have been close no matter what. If you'll forgive me, I must check on the fawns. Elienos and Telos appeared at the sound of my now mostly calm voice and took positions on either side of the doorframe. They both bled from various and numerous wounds, and Telos held high a clearly injured, possibly broken leg. He leaned heavily on the door frame. For that matter, Pietro looked to be in pretty bad shape, and cradling his left arm in his right. Elienos gave me a shattered look. My lord, we are all that remain. We took down one of the young Minoans and all of the opposing fawns. We have captured their satyr. He is unconscious and wounded, and carefully bound. The wolves are out warding your mount. He and they fought bravely, of course. Fawns gratefully scripted the flasks of Osignabil I offered them. It would help slow or stop their bleeding and soothe some of their pain and distress. I looked at Tom. Would you allow us to pass through your world if there's a portal that will get us home quickly? He blinked hard again and then rolled his eyes. He swirled and presented his balloon knot, tail straight up in the air, as he wound his way past in aloof feline fashion. Cats, my mind shouted. As usual, the sentiment was heavily laden with gratitude for my exceptional friend. I sent Elienos out to fetch the wolves and MB around to meet us on the backside of the house. The two fawns who could walk then assisted the one who could not, and I was left to either carry or drag the prisoner. I saw that he was playing possum and caught one slitted eye as he closed it. Get up and walk. You are my prisoner and are on parole as long as I choose to keep you alive. My friends may not be so generous. He sighed and shrugged as best he could with the bindings around his upper torso and around his wrists. I saw that his legs were hobbled and considered assisting him, but something told me to stand clear. The instinct proved correct, as he snapped out both feet in an attempt to kick me. I swiftly returned the favor, and his newly barked shins demonstrated that I could still deliver a pretty strong effort, despite my fatigue and fresh wounds. I decided against another kick to his hindquarters as he deliberately climbed slowly to his feet. He was attempting to goad me, and it was working. Look, I only barely brought you myself back from the battle, Joy. Perhaps you are familiar with such a state? He did not answer, but he shivered a little and picked up his pace. He may have shivered from fear or due to his nakedness. Apparently, satyrs did not wear clothes. Guess old Malion wasn't a perv. It was just his nature to be naked. I smiled inwardly. Pietro called to me. My lord, this one is known to me. He is called Apiseos, sometimes the Wicked, or Soiled One. My captive whirled on my squad leader. Traitor! How dare you speak of our kind to a stranger? How warped you are to serve such as he! What has happened to your proper lord, your satyr? I jerked him back to face front before he was able to spit at my brave fawns, then slapped him on the back of the head the way anyone would wish to treat a recalcitrant fool. I had the advantage of being able to do as I willed, and as I saw fit, rather than having to cleave to any singular rule that would apply across the board. It felt great to be high fae. Best mind your manners, or I'll put breeches on you, maybe even a shirt. The prisoner looked at me in consternation. These fawns are braver than any beings I've encountered, and their satyr was one whose name should not be profaned by your foul mouth. They are the best trained and finest warriors you will find in any army. Even outnumbered, they mopped up your lot. Guess you are not such a great lord after all. I looked over my shoulder and winked at my team, each of whom, despite his wounds, grinned proudly. Tom soon led us through the kitchen door and across the patio where we'd spoke for the first time. Well, where he'd spoken to me for the first time, at least in something other than cat kinetics. He paused at a small gap that led to an opening between two short hedgerows. The portal was there in the space, not a large one, and with the plant growth around it, not one that anyone would find accidentally. It was an odd angle, so that we had to climb as we stepped towards the other side. Tom leapt through the first, and I led Apicios. I didn't like having to squeeze in so closely with a bare dude, but I didn't trust him. Just as well, Tom had leapt up onto a flat boulder. Between the rock and the portal was a deep fissure in the hard surface of the ground. It was easy to pass with warning. My charge and I both stumbled. I shoved him to the ground on the flat stone and stepped back to warn my troops. There was no need. They were part goat after all. But one had a likely broken leg, and I cared for them as best I could by giving the warning. The wolves were not thrilled about the destination, but MB was game. He needed the warning more than the others. Horses tend to break legs in holes and fissures. He grinned and tossed his head as he squeezed his bulk through the passage. I leapt back just to once more seize Apicios' arm. He scrambled to his feet, but lacked the time to create whatever trouble he had in mind. Tom sat near, his tongue flashed out for a moment before he spoke. Why would a chieftain travel with such a small band in a dangerous world, especially when he has incurred the wrath of high fae and greater beings? You defeated your most imminent foe, but you have angered many who would see you fall. He shook his head in an anthropomorphic manner. Come along, we'll get you tended. You owe me for this, and other things, you know. Great, I lamented. A third king that wanted something from me. I had racked up some large debts. He continued, Now we'll continue after my folk have treated your valiant fawns. That got him nod bows from my three. They gave no smiles, though. They hadn't cared for the manner in which he'd spoken to their chosen liege. I'd grown used to it. Besides, royalty had certain privileges, particularly within their own realms, worlds, etc. The fawn's wounds and my own were soon addressed, and a proper repast was set before us. Several quasi-anthro catfolk, who looked like the same kind as Makcha, had been taken our prisoner in tow and assured us that he would be watched carefully. Their coats were as varied as one would see in a mixed litter, and I thought back fondly on the acerbic, wizen being who had played a short but significant role in bringing me home. It was a long while before Tom made another appearance. In the meantime, my team had curled up to rest on the divans we had been supplied. Even the wolves dozed. They'd stayed outside as I'd ordered, and the ambush team hadn't been able to get them in force. I could tell that they were unhappy and regretted that their friends had suffered. while they maintained the rear guard and lesser fight. I reassured them that they'd played their role as they should, and one day be the vanguard or the rear guard that saved us all. There were no stables, but MB was allowed to roam free inside the caged compound. Our host explained that the cage was not to keep MB inside as much to keep roving carnivores outside. This was a cat world, after all. There was plenty of ripe, juicy grass and a cold, clear stream in the compound, so MB was happy enough. I sat on my own divan, eventually leaning back to rest for a moment, then awakened to Tom's gaze as he lounged on a very nice divan, sized to his form. If you hadn't awakened, I would have had to take matters into my own paws, he growled, but projected a light humor. I held up a hand. I know. With a proper force, we'd have been able to take care of it on our own. My fault entirely. I relaxed too much after we defeated Serpentay. I thought I could handle that world. It's where I grew up, after all. I finished lamely. He studied me for a moment. Grown up. He stared a while longer, and then continued in a softer tone. You should know that Sorsha inherited the house, not the others. Perhaps she will put it in your name. Not likely she will be able to flip-flop into a realtor's office to bark out instructions now that Ellie is dead. You'll have to contact your old friend with the police department. Another mess you've left for her. I simply stared. I found my mouth gaping a little and snapped it closed. Idiotic expressions would only deepen his sarcasm. Oh, what about Shane? He gave the impression of a shrug. Why should you care? You used him, and in doing so ensured that he will promote within his company. He'll be better off in the city, closer to work and his girlfriend. You and your grandfather have different views on the relative worth of mortals. They have their uses, and we have ours. You know that Sorsha was a good influence on you. You can clearly see the improvement she made. You still have far to go. Grown up. I raised an eyebrow. I felt the impression that he had been getting the small subject cleared from our pathway, blowing on the fur before he reaching the hide. You realize, of course, that not all of those beings and creatures were what they seemed. I shrugged. Frankly, I had no time to consider the details of their forces, only to defend myself and my troops as best as I could. What or whom do you believe led the force? He quizzed me. Ellie said that the big Minolian was called Zlatislav. I'm pretty sure he serves my false grandfather Croesus. He led the force, but the orders were from old Goldilocks himself. Tom radiated a hint of disappointment and resignation. Zlatislav was not a Minolian that led to the ambush. It was Croesus himself, the blood in his lineage that prevents him from making the change belonged to an ancestor who found the females of a certain pride to be irresistible. Croesus is able to transform himself into a Minolian. Zlatislav died from wounds suffered raiding your grandfather's care. More of you have difficult discerning one Minolian from another. It's not a mere glamour. He can assume the form. It works something like your wolf pelt belt, but is intrinsic to his ancestry. He shares the same lust as his ancestor, and likes to take the form to go about his business. In fact, the young Minolians were his get. You have robbed him of yet more of his offspring. He will not thank you for it. He stood. We'll get you home tomorrow morning. after most of my folk go to sleep for the day. This time there was no balloon knot, only the dark swirl as the King of Cats moved on about his duties. He said all that he would for the time being. The return journey was uneventful, and as much as I could enjoy anything, I liked seeing Tom's kingdom within Cat World. It was a riotous warren of rocks, trees, crevices, and all manners of small creatures hopped about, easy prey for the paws and fangs of the diverse felinoids. Streams trickled and flowed into small pools from which all and sundry drank. There were larger ponds in which tiger forms and other cat folk that were so inclined could bathe or even swim. Tom's kingdom primarily consisted of familiar cats and their quasi-anthro cat associates. However, he welcomed many of their larger kin from all over their world. It was from our escorts, all Tiger Clan as it happened, that we discovered that Tom was a king, not the only king, and that they all served a high king who resided elsewhere on the world. When we reached the portal, I was surprised that our new friends did not remain on Cat World, but rather stepped through alongside us. On the other side, the 4 lithe, fey-sized tigers and the single tiger, quasi-anthro, halted and faced me. Tiger Man gave a ferocious and frightening grin.
"We have elected to join your service if you will have us. It seems that you have interesting enemies, and we are inclined to serve in Otherworld Prime, as we style it, for a time. King Tom tells me you are a chieftain and have a province. You are getting started. We are all young and looking to have some fun and gain a good reputation. From what we've seen and heard in rumors, you like to accept service from any worthy being or creature. We wish to give you a chance to earn our service for a time." As with so many other beings in Otherworld, it associated worlds and realms. These seemed very confident, almost arrogant. I liked that since it mirrored my own demeanor. "I would be honored to accept your service. You will appear to be worthy beings and creatures. When we arrive at my grandfather's castle, we can have an official welcoming ceremony." Piero, now bandaged, draped with a sling and looking a little embarrassed, interrupted. "My lord, when we reach the final portal, perhaps you could shift our arrival so that more time will have passed in Otherworld while we were gone. Perhaps your own fort will be nearly complete." I nodded, agreed. Yet we shall still stop to visit the Mactir Moor on the way. He will want to know of the events at the Gosling Puzzle House, and may be of help with questioning our new friend. I nodded towards Apeisos, who was flanked and followed by my loyal and awesome wolves. They'd appreciated the job since they hadn't been able to do much in the dust-up in which the satyr was captured. He stood nonchalantly, trying to look insouciant despite his bonds and his swinging wing dang doodle. Besides, our dungeons may not have had time to get dank enough to provide the proper level of discomfort to those who enjoy going about in their birthday suits. So we have in custody one of the primary leaders of the raids in my territory. The big bad wolf glowered at Apeisos, who now stood alone in the large, formal audience chamber at my grandfather's castle. He dropped all pretenses of calmness and trunculency. The dark-hued satyr simply stared and looked at the floor in the center between himself and the big chair on the dais. There were plenty of folk present, so there was no opportunity for him to escape. "Tell me why your master dared to attack my realm and that of my king. Tell me what caused you to commit murder on our very doorstep, and why you attempted to slaughter my grandson." No presumption of innocence in Otherworld.
Nice when one was the accuser.
My Lord Wolf, I only follow orders. There was no plan to commit murders. We had no sooner crossed the portal when the guardian wolves struck. We only defended ourselves.
The satyr glanced up when he began to speak, with just a hint of intransience, but otherwise kept his eyes trained on the tiles between he and the chief of his captors. Grandfather rumbled. You raided afterwards, and you have only just assaulted the Red Wolf and his band. Tyree knew that the game was played, and used his next card wisely. Were you born into service of Croesus, or did you volunteer? He knew the answer. Satyrs were not passed on as generational servants, as were lesser beings. He'd chosen to deliberately offer the captive. Perhaps he'd hoped that in his anger, Apaisos might offer more information than he intended. He was not disappointed.
Satyrs are not born to servitude, he spat. We choose our masters. I chose one that seemed successful, that served the high court of Griffin Hall. I did not know that he, in actuality, served a different mistress. In my fawns, and he saw only pawns to aid his plans. Yet once I committed to his service, I was honor-bound to serve loyalty. That is the nature of my folk, so I make no apologies. I took my own turn at interrogation, getting more like a cop every day. Scary. Should probably consult with Falk on techniques. So now that you are a captive, what degree of loyalty do you still owe to Croesus? Apaisos stood thoughtfully for a moment before he replied. Typically, I'd say there's nothing had changed regarding my capture. That is true. However, Croesus fled when our forces were on the brink of victory. The being from whom he fled was a very powerful one. Regarding my capture, that is true. However, Croesus fled when our forces were on the brink of victory. The being from whom he fled was very powerful, and he did not owe allegiance to that king. I need some time to consider, and I want answers from him. If he deserted us to our fates, then we owe him no fealty. If he had made a tactical retreat, then I must continue to serve, despite the loss of my troop. I thought that was fair enough, and apparently Grandfather agreed. Well, enough. If you swear an oath that you will not attempt escape or harm anyone in this fortress, or anyone outside who is an ally or part of our forces, you will be confined to a suite on the upper levels. If you remain faithful to your oath, even should you still find that you must serve our enemy, you may be paroled within the confines of this care. The satyr bowed in acquiescence. My Lord Wolf is fair and honorable. My gratitude. He appeared humble enough. Many Fae seem to have mercurial temperaments, but I still didn't trust him. So quoth this raven. Thank you for stopping by, my darlings. It means so much. I so enjoy telling these stories for you. And here are some of my marvelous supporters. Please, if you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. If you give this video a like, it would help me out ever so much. Thank you, and have a lovely, lovely day.